trainer, and communications consultant.
19 number one best-selling.
You have been nominated and won so many awards throughout your careers.
She has a wealth of experience interviewing and consulting with well-renowned figures, celebrities, and corporations. Nadia speaks on how to get people to like you, trust you, and want to do business with you.
Over the last few weeks, the entire world has been monitoring the treatment of your grandfather, Nelson Mandela. And my job was to introduce it and provide.
With topics like leveraging the power of your personal presence, networking for success, and lighting the fire. Nadia Bilchik.
So I'm going to ask you, before I introduce you to my illustrious guest, to take a moment and think about where you were a year ago. A year ago, I was in Fayetteville, Arkansas, doing an in-person session for Coca-Cola, and now I am virtual. And Todd Cherches, my guest today, is someone who I would not have met if it wasn't for COVID-19. So Todd, first of all, it's been a pleasure getting to know you, albeit virtually.
Thank you, Nadia. After seeing you on TV, on CNN all these years, and you've interviewed George Clooney and all these people, it's like I'm honored to be speaking to you. So
yes, but George Clooney has not written a book called Visual Leadership.
No,
but I'm going to read this just because I thought it was such a good introduction to you. And it's that Todd Cherches is the CEO and co-founder of the Big Blue Gumball, an innovative New York City-based management and leadership consulting, training, and executive coaching firm. He's a TEDx speaker, the power of visual thinking, and a two-time award-winning Adjunct Professor of Leadership at the NYU School of Professional Studies, Division of Programs in Business, as well as a lecturer on leadership at Columbia University. So Todd, I have loved reading Visual Leadership, and I really like that you start off saying, and maybe this is something we can ask people who are joining us now, when you think of leadership, what is the first word that often comes to mind? And you say it's
vision. I've done this all the time, and people will, I would say 80% of people say vision or visionary or something related to the metaphor of seeing.
And I said to you, the first person who came to my mind when I read your book was Nelson Mandela had a vision. I always say he had a dream that became a vision, and a vision that he turned into reality that was a democratic and is a democratic South Africa. So for me, the ultimate leader who had a vision. But when you ask your students to break it down, what happens?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about, vision. We talk about someone being a visionary leader or a leadership visionary. And we talk about Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr., Steve Jobs, Elon Musk. What does it mean to be a visionary leader? It's to have a picture in your mind's eye. And the term the mind's eye was coined by Shakespeare in Hamlet when he saw the ghost of his father, and he didn't know if it was an apparition or a figment of his imagination, right? So he saw it in his mind's eye, not with his physical eye. The challenge as a leader is, how do you turn that vision into a reality? How do you make that picture of a future that is different from and better than today's reality into something new and different and better, not only for yourself, but for others as well? So that's what it's about. The rainbow eye on the cover of the book represents both diversity and inclusion. And thank you. I see a visual, right? It's right. So the rainbow, just as no one in the world has that color eye, no one in the world sees the world through the same lens that you do. So our job is to flip the lens, what I call flipping the lens, and try to see the world through with empathy and compassion, and see the world through the lens of others, and not only help your vision become a reality, but help other people turn their visions into reality. So it's a big part of what it's about.
So you work with individuals, with organizations to help their leaders become more visual in their leadership style. Just to differentiate, having a vision in itself is not enough.
Yeah, it's just having there's two components. One is formulating the vision, the picture in your mind's eye. The other is communicating that vision, articulating it in a clear, compelling, and inspiring way that will get others on board with the vision. If it just only exists in your head, if Mandela just had that vision in his mind's eye, so what, right? It's like, how did you change? You have to change the world, but you can't do it alone, right? You have to do it through and with other people. And that's the biggest challenge of being a visionary leader, is not only the formulation, but the articulation of that vision.
So it's having the vision, then getting the alignment, and then the execution.
Exactly.
So let's go through the chapters, just because you've set them out so brilliantly. Let's start off with visual models.
Yeah, so models or frameworks, a company's organizational chart is a model or framework, right? a 4-box matrix that we see in the consulting world, like the time management matrix or situational leadership. Maslow's hierarchy of needs would be a model. So a model is a visual representation of reality, right? So there's that saying we need to think outside the box, which has kind of become a cliche, but you can't think outside the box until you put something inside the box, right? So what I
unpack that a little. What's an example of that?
Well, here's a metaphor. We're going to talk about metaphors in just a second, but a metaphor of that might be, let's say you need to set a table for 8 people, right? You open up one silverware drawer and all the silverware is just thrown in there randomly from last time. How long is that going to take you to find 8 table settings, right? You open up the next drawer and then you have everything in compartments, knives, spoons, forks, different sizes, right? How much quicker and more efficiently and effectively will you see the solution to your problem, which is I need 8 table settings, right? So that's what a model does. It enables you to put things into a framework or some kind of compartmentalized system. So basically, we're trying to simplify complexity so that we could see and execute decisions. So that's basically what models and frameworks do. So what I help people do is kind of take the messiness and complexity of life and put in some kind of diagram or framework or visual so that they could see it more clearly. And I have a number of examples of that, from using napkin sketching to draw something out, where I talk about them in my book. With one of my clients, he had an east and west separation for his company. And I said, well, what if you separate it to north and south instead? And the light bulb went off, metaphor. And he said, that's the solution, right? But until I drew it out on a napkin, he didn't see it. And I thought it was so simple and obvious that it was a stupid suggestion, but that solved his problem. So right there, by creating a mental map of the situation, he was able to see a solution that he hadn't seen before.
So anybody who's joining us right now, I'm talking to Todd Cherches. The book is Visual Leadership. We're breaking it down for you. So if somebody has an issue, you're saying create it, draw it, find a way so that you can turn it into a shareable model.
Exactly. I worked in Hollywood for a number of years. I used to work for Disney and CBS, developing TV shows. And one of the things that we would do is we would do a mind map, right? You would take a central character and then you would just draw lines and kind of, or with Post-its, you could lay them out, but you would map out the characters and the relationships. And then, so then you had a visual, basically a brain dump of everything you were thinking, that everyone could see it. And then you might do a storyboard. Disney actually invented the storyboard process when he was creating animated movies, going back to Mickey Mouse and Snow White. So then when you storyboard something, and you're from the TV industry, and I'm sure you've used storyboards before. So whether you use index cards, Post-its, it doesn't really matter. The whole thing is basically, how do you basically, there's 2 phases. There's divergent thinking, where you're coming up with an idea and going all different directions. And then there's convergent thinking, where you're bringing that together to try to find some solution. So again, you're using mental models and pictures and illustration to try to basically conceptualize what you're talking about and simplify the complexity so you can make better decisions and then execute on those decisions.
Okay, so let's say Elon Musk right now, and his vision is to do what? I'm just trying to make it very concrete.
Mm-hmm. Well, he has so many visions. He has visions of building colonies on Mars, of building a tunnel between LA and San Francisco. Of, I don't even know what other visions he has, but he has all these pictures in his mind's eye. To execute on those visions and make them real, he needs to communicate them to other people, get people on board, and then you have to. In my classes, we spend a lot of time distinguishing between leadership and management, right? Leadership comes up with these visions and strategies, and the management side of things, and it's not separate people, they're separate functions. The management side of things is what executes a plan, right? Then you're putting in schedules and budgets and staffing and training people. So we need to do both, right? Leadership without management is big ideas with no execution. Management without leadership is execution and it's task focused, but there's no big ideas, there's no change. So I do a lot of teaching around John Cotter's work from Harvard about the distinctions, the subtle but important distinctions between management and leadership, which many people use those terms interchangeably, but they're very different functions.
Okay, so Todd, I feel like whoever is joining us who can get a pen and paper needs to. I just want to break down. So it's John Cotter's work, the difference between management and leadership. I know for you, this is very fundamental, but there are people who see our time together really as a lesson, as a masterclass, and see we can't get to Columbia or NYU, many of us. I so appreciate you taking the time just to share these critical things with us. So then you speak about using metaphors.
Yeah, so metaphors, what's interesting is even though I teach management and leadership, my background is in Shakespeare and poetry. I was an English literature major as an undergrad. So,
which is why so many beautiful Shakespearean allusions.
That's true. That's true. And it's allusions, not illusions, right?
That's right. Allusions.
So, but the use of metaphor is not just, for poets and songwriters, right? To say something is like something else. I keep this on my desk, little visual. My wife got me this. This is an iceberg, right? So if you talk about
visual.
So if you talk about an iceberg, when you first meet someone, it's just the tip of the iceberg, right? Your first impressions. When someone's an overnight success, we only see the overnight success. We don't see the 30 years of pain, suffering, struggle, and failure that went into it. An iceberg might also represent, as in Titanic, a danger, right? Something up ahead that if we only go by what we see, we don't know what's lurking
underneath. The Titanic was not sunk by the tip of the iceberg, but everything underneath. And so much of communication is missed because we don't look at what's underneath. So critical. And by the way, we're talking about how you as a leader communicate your vision. And are you using metaphors as well as you could? And are you working with somebody and thinking laterally? Because metaphors are a brilliant way of reaching the people that then execute. So we're talking about becoming a visual leader, communicating your vision. So the next thing you talk about is the power of telling stories as a visual leader.
Yeah, stories, like as a manager, let's say, you could say to someone, do this or don't do this. But if a manager / leader says, let me tell you about the worst mistake I ever made in my life, or when I had your job, you wouldn't believe what happened to me. Who wouldn't want to hear that, right? So it's like the power and it's by stories that people are led, right? People are not motivated, inspired by a 500-page Excel spreadsheet, right? It's, Martin Luther King, the famous thing is Martin Luther King said, I have a dream. He didn't say I have a 500-page business plan, right, on how we're going to do this, right? So you're putting your vision out there. And stories, why stories? Stories are human, they are emotional, they are memorable. Stories have Aristotle talked about this thousands of years ago, right? Stories have beginnings, middles, and ends. Stories have victims, villains, and heroes. There's a hero's journey. There are obstacles to be overcome. There's the quest. There are success stories. There are also failure stories and cautionary tales, right? So the power, and you know this because you're from the news business, right? What would news be without stories, right? So it's not just facts and figures. It's the stories that make them compelling and inspiring and informative, right?
And how skilled are we at finding those stories? And I think, as you say so well, and we know the storytelling is a very powerful way of communication because it impacts people both on an intellectual and an emotional level. But the context you put it in as a way of sharing your vision, so to speak, is so critical. And, again, thinking back to examples, what's a Todd example of a story that you tell that has an impact?
The story that resonates most with people because it's so horrifying is when I worked and it's in my book, I worked for a TV network. I was an assistant to the manager of drama program development, and talk about drama. I was sitting at my desk and all of a sudden I felt something whip by my head and my boss had thrown a box of pens at me because they were the wrong ones. So instead of just saying, hey, Todd, these are the wrong pens, she literally whipped open her door, threw them at me, missed my head by inches, and started screaming at me in front of all my peers. And if you can't even order a box of pens, maybe you better find yourself another job. It's like when I teach feedback in my leadership classes, I say, is there any other way you might have delivered that same feedback? It's like, nope, I can't think of anything. That's the only thing I can think, right? So, that story will resonate. It's like, has anyone ever had a manager like that? Have you ever acted like that? Have you ever responded emotionally and maybe overreacted to something? So you can have a whole conversation around that. But if I just said, don't lose
your temper.
Right? But that story, you just never forget it. And you also empathize, right? You can imagine being in my shoes or in my seat and what that must have felt like. So now it's funny in retrospect, and I talk about it. It wasn't so funny at the time, right?
No, it's very humiliating. Just a curious follow-up and digress for a moment. Is that person someone you're still in touch with? What has ever happened to them?
Thankfully, no. She ended up, long story short, she ended up a few weeks later, she ended up firing me. And here's a story. I went down to her boss's boss. I had my box packed. I said, just wanted to say goodbye. He's like, where are you going? It's 10 a.m. And I said, so-and-so, I won't mention her name, just fired me. He said, no, she didn't. Tell her to get down here. Go back to work. So I'm standing there with my box, walking up and down. Everyone's looking at me. I'm walking around with my box, like, am I fired or not fired? And he started screaming at her from around the corner. and she just her mascara was streaming down her face, and she just said, "You're not fired, get back to work," and she just slammed her door. And she ended up being put on notice, getting fired a few months later. I took over her job temporarily during pilot season with the promise that I would be promoted to her job. And then what happened, one day they bring in someone else and say, "Here's your new boss. Can you train him?" So,
Todd, they say success is the best revenge. And one thing you have been is very successful. It's interesting.
I just want to say my book is dedicated first to my wife, secondly to my parents, and thirdly to all the horrible bosses without whom none of this would have been possible. So I just wanted to say I learned. Nelson Mandela said, "I never lose. I either win or I learn." And I love that quote. So I try to learn from all and use these stories in a productive way to help others.
And, part of your book as a leader to be able to really look at those stories and look at the stories where you might not have been so successful and what was the learning points and the vulnerability and the authenticity, and to build up your inventory of stories. And if you don't have them, to go back. It was even an incident that, someone throwing a box of pens at you, the way you tell the story and the fact that you have this background in Shakespeare, telling it in a way that's very evocative. And it may not be a literal box of pens or pencils that someone's throwing at you. It may be a proverbial, but how did that make you feel? So those things are so critical. So thank you. Storytelling, and it's the verbal and the nonverbal, and how powerful stories are in sharing your vision. Then you have a chapter on what now, what next.
Yeah, you always want to be thinking about, what do I do with what I just learned, right? So one suggestion is to keep a journal. I advise all my students, all my clients, just write things down. It gives you a reality check. I kept an abuse journal when I was at that TV network. I won't say which one. It had a C, a B, and an S in its name, but other than that, I won't identify. It's much better now. She's no longer there. That was 20 years ago, so no hard feelings. I still watch shows on that network. But if you document things, first of all, it helps you to just get out of your mind. So just writing things down, capturing your thoughts, writing down your questions, your concerns, your fears. You can look back and see, like you were talking about, what were you doing a year ago before the pandemic really hit? I've been keeping a journal. A little part of my obsessive compulsiveness. I started keeping a journal my first day of college, and I won't say what year it was, but it was a long time ago, and I have not missed a day since. I literally write in my journal every single day. So I'll give it away. I'm up to year 41, journal 41. And
that is remarkable, Todd, and just a way of processing and sharing and looking at your life.
And what was great is when I had to sit down and write my book, I had all the names and dates and places, and just thumbing through when I was at Disney, when I was at Aaron Spelling, I was able to look back and see all my stories, my thoughts, my feelings at the time. So it all came flooding back. And again, that's the power of visual. If I had typed it out, it would have been very different than seeing my handwritten notes, which is using a kinesthetic part of your brain when you handwrite something. So I always think my book's about visual thinking, but there's visual, auditory, reading and writing, and kinesthetic, right? So visual is through the eye, auditory through the ear, reading and writing is text and numbers based, and then kinesthetic is about movement, touch, and feeling. So you want to leverage all of those senses if you can, because then the emotions come flooding back and your memories come flooding back, and then you can really use those stories and learn from them and share your wisdom with other people.
Now, there are 10 tough questions that you think every leader should be asked. And what are those questions? You don't need to share all 10, because I really am encouraging people to get a copy of Visual Leadership, but just share some of the questions.
Yeah, I'm going by memory now. So, a few of them is, first of all, just how do you define leadership? I once went to an NYU leadership symposium where they had professors from all the different schools, NYU Stern and the nursing school and social work. And we had a whole discussion debate about what is leadership. There was two camps. There's the capital L leadership, which is leadership is about having a title, you're CEO, a VP, or director of something. And the small L camp that I was in starts with the premise that everyone is a leader, right? My personal mission statement is making the world a better place, one leader at a time. And to me, everyone is a leader. So if you start with that foundation, you have to lead your own life, right? You have to lead and manage your own life, even if regardless of your title or your position. And if you start from there, then it's like, how do I influence other people? So just that question about how do you personally define leadership is an interesting question. And then who are the leadership role models in your life? It could be a Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela, but it could also be your grandparents, or it could be a high school teacher who was a big influence for me. So that's the thing to think about. It's like, ask yourself these questions about what leadership lessons have you learned, and how have your views of leadership evolved over the course of your lifetime?
It's so interesting. I teach a program on leadership presence, and I always say, what is one personal example and one professional? And it's always wonderful when someone says, my mother, my father, my grandfather, because for so many people, it's the converse. And then one professional. And also as a reminder to leaders who are joining us today, is you think about the person who's impacted you, you are now that person for others.
Yeah.
And so I think I want to go back to the 10 questions, because I think they are so valid. Just, what you think people should be asking. And
which one resonated most with you? Just if I want to turn the tables around, of the 10 questions, is there any one that jumped out at you and said this was either interesting or challenging or thought-provoking?
Well, I really like the ability to look at who positively influenced you, who was a good leader for you, and then just being able to be introspective and to do the work around, is the way that I am providing experience congruent with the overall way I want to be perceived?
Yeah.
Because so often there's a disconnect between how I want to project myself as a leader. And, often people speak about, I just read a really good article, Todd. It says, every leader needs a fool. Shakespearean reference. What do they mean by that? Every leader should have somebody who tells them the truth.
Yeah.
Because in Shakespearean time, there was the fool who was the person who, in a very humorous way, told you the truth. And that too many leaders have yes people around them. So who do you trust that's actually giving you some very real feedback?
Yeah. Like the fool in King Lear, the fool wiser than the king, right? So like, as you're just saying, wisdom can come from anywhere. It's not just from experience. It's and one other thing about the fool, and because this is an important theme in my life, is humor, right? Seeing the humor in even painful situations, like in the horrible bosses that I've had. Again, it's not funny in the moment, but if you can look back and find some humor in it, if say you had the worst day ever, you wouldn't believe what happened to me today. To find the humor in, and it's not making fun of things or making fun of people, but the humanity, the humor in human behavior. And if we could find that humor in it and tell funny stories that we could learn lessons from it. Like, I'm a big Seinfeld fan. There's so many lessons in leadership from Seinfeld if you see it through that lens, right? So I think humor is next to story, as part of storytelling, is an effective way to get a message across.
Well, I know, hearing some of the reviews from your students, that you definitely infuse your lectures with a great deal of humor. I always think of Shirley MacLaine. She says, if you can learn to laugh at yourself, you'll be forever amused. There's just an element of, do we take ourselves so seriously?
Well, a few visual examples, just like when I talk about ABC, always be curious. I keep this on my desk. This is Curious George, right? So if this little, it's like, here I am teaching in a graduate program at Columbia or NYU, and I'm holding up this little doll, but you will never forget it, right? Curious George, be flexible, right? Sometimes we need to bend over backwards to help someone.
Okay,
right?
I'm feeling that. I'm feeling that, because those are good visuals.
Yeah.
But curiosity, you speak about leaders asking themselves questions. Am I curious? Do I really listen? Bill Nye, the science guy, always says, everyone you meet knows something you don't. Even somebody who is a direct report or who has less so-called status or power, right?
Yeah. Well, I use that with my students all the time, because, if I have a 25-year-old female student from Beijing who feels like I haven't worked, I don't really have much to contribute. It's like, I've never been a 25-year-old student from Beijing. Teach me something. I'm sure you have a million experiences, but if you frame it, I was once doing a storytelling workshop for CEOs, and one CEO said, I hate storytelling. I'm terrible at storytelling. And I said, well, why do you say that? They went on to tell this great story about how much he hates storytelling and why he hates storytelling. And everyone was like, wow, that was such an amazing story. So often we put storytelling on this pedestal, like I can't be a great orator, but we just share our experiences. We all have stories. Grandparents tell stories, children tell stories, cavemen tell stories, and by drawing cave drawings, right? So it's just stories are just embedded in who we are as humans, right?
So I like what you're saying. So for those people who have some kind of resistance, to think about it more as sharing your life experiences as a story, sharing the lessons you've learned. Another great quote that I like is, don't let good suffering go to waste. You've had it. What did you learn? What did you move on? Todd, I facilitate and host a lot of panel discussions, and panel discussions can be very boring unless people are telling stories. And, you know, going back to asking somebody like you, what's the best decision you ever made? Well, you had your book released in May of 2020, right? Which turned into be a great decision, who would have known? And then asking, you know, what's a decision you made that looking back you could have done differently? Anything comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I mean, there are jobs I took for the wrong reasons. I took a job years ago as vice president of business development for a web design company that was based in Denver. They needed someone to run their New York office. And I loved the CEO, the culture. It was my highest salary, my first VP title. And I crashed and burned from day two. Day one was fine. Day two was when it first started to go downhill. It just was a mismatch for my fit, I have a model called the passion skill matrix, and it was not a fit for my sweet spot of where my passions and my skills intersected. So I tried to learn to like it. I tried to get better at it. It was basically a sales job and business development. That's not me. That's not who I am. It's not what I'm good at. And we realized after like 90 days that, hey, let's just, you know, we're still friends, but it just didn't work out. So I don't regret it because I learned from it, but it was a decision I made for the wrong reasons at that time. But again, you live and learn and you move forward.
But it's still a good story if you can tie it into the people you're saying and saying, so if you find yourself in a situation where maybe the job isn't a right fit, here's some things you can do. Yeah. You know, always the tie-in.
I always in terms of insights, actions, and outcomes. So insight is, what did you learn? The light bulb went off. What are you thinking about now that you wouldn't have? Actions is like, what are you going to do with that now? And outcomes is, if you have this idea and you implement this idea, what do you think the result will be? What will the payoff be? What will the change be? So if you frame, so every chapter of my book has a place to fill in your insights and actions at the end of the chapter, because it captures it right there when it's fresh in your mind in the moment, as opposed to like when you're done with the book, because everything blends together. So just even breaking things down to bite-sized pieces and giving yourself a chance to pause and reflect. Again, journaling is great for that, but just, you know, capture those things in the moment, and over the course of your lifetime, you can actually measure and see the progress that you've made over time.
So helpful. I know this is about the 51st podcast you've done, and I think it's probably like the 5th you've done today. So thank you for sharing your insight, wisdom, expertise. 12 authors. Now, you don't need to go through all, but maybe just one. An author, I know somebody, you are on the 100 coaching, or somebody you work with who's a great coach, of course, is...
Well, Marshall Goldsmith is like
the coach. Author.
He's the coach of all coaches, and his book, What Got You There, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, was life-changing for me. It's on the shelf right behind me. It's one of my go-to books. And one of the things I've been reading an average of one business book a week since 1998. So I've read about 1,100 and counting since then. So someone said, when are you going to stop reading all these books and writing a book? So that's when I finally sat down and stopped reading and started writing. And I locked myself away in this office during the summer of 2019 to get my book done finally. Because I had talked about it for years, like someday, when, until you actually make the commitment to do it, it doesn't just magically happen. So you actually have to have the discipline to stop something else. It's like, what are you willing to give up in order to make something else happen? So I had to give up reading my business books for a few months to really focus on mine. So in terms of so many books, I mean, Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People is a
classic, right?
Yeah, the stories are a little outdated, but still, when you read it in the context of 1936, those principles are as true. The importance of people's names, right? Knowing them, pronouncing them correctly. He said that a person's name is the sweetest sound in any language to that person, right? So those timeless human relations principles are as true today, both online and offline, as they were all those years ago.
No question. Well, if you're looking for a really worthwhile read, Visual Leadership, Todd Cherches, I know it is available on Amazon. If people want to reach you, what is the best way of reaching out to you?
Yeah, the two best ways, just go to my new website, toddcherches.com, and you can actually download my list for free of my top 52 visual leadership books. And also connect with me on LinkedIn. I live on LinkedIn. I'm always there. So always happy to connect with people and engage in the conversation anytime.
Okay, and we do have a couple of comments. So Ethan says hello. Somebody else says they hate the story that happened to you. They're so sorry that happened to you.
I appreciate empathy is an important part of leadership. So I appreciate the empathy and compassion of relating to that story.
And being human, right? We're at an age of just being human. So Todd, first of all, a year later, what a pleasure to be sharing virtual space.
Thank you.
My last thoughts, and then I'd love you to share yours, is to everybody who's joining us today, whether you're watching us live or taped. This has been an unprecedented year, right?
Yes.
It's been a year of so much volatility, uncertainty, change, ambiguity. It has. And just taking a moment and asking yourself, and to Todd's point, perhaps journal it. What were your challenges this year? What has been incredibly difficult? But what are at least two things that have been positive? So for me, two things have been positive, and I'm just going to mention two because there's been a multitude. Todd, having our mastermind group and meeting people of your caliber and having these conversations where I learn and I know the people who are joining us learn, that's been positive. Another thing that I think has been positive, and I'm curious for you, is people's acceptance of imperfection. So we all had a sense of, having to be, and there were so many, people talking about vulnerability and all of that, but what did it really mean? And I think this year has certainly taught us that being authentic and vulnerable and real is acceptable. And the support, certainly, that I've received, and I want to thank each and every person who is watching and joining us, because you have been part of that support. So where we'll be this time next year, I don't know, but 12th of March, 2022, I hope to be talking to Todd Cherches again. Last thoughts from you.
Sure. Yeah, we would not have met if not for the camaraderie of. I think one of the things I talk about in my NYU class, which is in the human resources program, is how do we put the humanity back into human resources? So as we think about the future of work and everything everyone's gone through, I think this has kind of like humanized us, leveled the playing field in some ways. I'm 6'4", but one of the things I say is on Zoom, we're all the same height. Right? So it's kind of, there's no, and what's interesting too, if you're sitting in a classroom, everyone's facing the professor, right? On Zoom, everyone's facing each other. And it's changed the whole dynamic.
Wow, that's a good point.
There's no sitting in the back row anymore when you're on Zoom, right? So if your camera's on and your mic's on, I always talk about, I just want to leave with 3 V's: visibility, voice, and value. Visibility is how are you seen and how are you seen? Voice is are you heard and how are you heard? And value is are you making a contribution? So if you're on a Zoom call and you put your camera on, and one of the things I learned from you is making eye contact with the camera. So I intentionally moved your picture front and center. I could look at you and the camera at the same time. And I would have been like this if not for you, that lesson from you. So thank you for teaching me that. So, but think about, are you being heard? Are you being seen? And are you adding value? I think that's one of the things that we want to do, not just for yourself, but to help other people. And then my 3 G's are be genuine, be generous, and be grateful. And I'll just leave it with that.
Well, Todd, you are all of those things. You're visible, you have a wonderful voice, and you are at value. You are very gracious. I hope you are grateful, and also generous, grateful, and
generous and genuine. Be yourself.
And
be
genuine. That you are for sure genuine. And you just, one last quote from a great leader. We spoke about Nelson Mandela. He spoke about Ubuntu. And Ubuntu was a word that meant we are human through the humanity of others. And I love that term of Ubuntu. So thank you so much, Todd. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've learned so much. And I look forward to this time next year, hopefully in person.
That would be great. Love to meet you in New York one of these days. Thank you, Nadia.
Fantastic. Hopefully we'll have to be sitting down because Todd is 6'4" and I am 5'3.5". 5'4" with heels. Thanks, Todd. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.